John 1:17 makes this statement, "For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." So what is the relationship between law and grace? Well, let's dig into that a little bit on this edition of Theology Thursday. This verse appears to show a real stark contrast, like either the law or grace and truth, or the law was bad, but grace is good. Moses was not great, but Jesus is awesome. And if that's the case, do we need to throw out the Old Testament? And there have been many through church history that have done that. Marcionism, named after a guy named Marcion, wanted to ditch the Old Testament. Arianism wanted to do the same thing. The Church of Christ today was started by a man named Campbell. They don't hold to the authority. They want just the New Testament, not the Old. And in many churches, this happens practically. Majority of Bible studies are done from the New Testament. The majority of sermons, estimated as many as 90% of sermons come from the New Testament. So though we may not say we don't really need the Old Testament because we don't want to say that, we know we're not supposed to, but in practical terms, we kind of live out that truth. And I think this is the kind of verse that undergirds that sort of mentality. So let's talk about law and grace and what this verse is really telling us and what the real relationship between law and grace. So both law and grace are the same because both of them come from the same God. Both of them are given to us by the same God. Both of them are equally inspired by God. We do not believe that some of the Bible is more inspired than other parts. It's all equally inspired. And so we don't hold to anything like that. We recognize that they are the same because of all those reasons. Equally inspired, both from the same God, both given by God. However, we recognize there's a difference. This verse clearly shows us a difference. And if they were the same, then law would equal grace, and it does not. One came by Moses, a fully human mediator. One came through Jesus, a fully human and fully divine mediator. And so there are some differences and distinctions. But let's talk about some of the similarities, theological similarities in particular, that I think will help us see what this verse is telling us and why this verse is so important and why we need both law and grace. So both of these are impossible. The law is impossible and grace is impossible. The law is impossible because it is impossible for us to keep it. It is too difficult. It is too complicated. It is too stringent. It is impossible for a sinful human being to live out perfectly the perfect law of a perfect God. So the law, when you start reading it, you go, I can't do all of that. I can't keep that. That's right. The law points out our failure. The Bible describes it as a schoolmaster or a guardian that brings us to a schoolmaster, brings us to the teacher. It brings us to grace. And so the law came by Moses, but it's impossible for us to achieve the law in our own strength. But grace is also impossible. You can't keep the law, and you can't do anything to earn grace. Grace is something that's given, not something that's earned. So it's impossible to keep the law, and it's impossible to earn grace. And so the impossibility of both is what makes them both needed and both significant. Okay? So both the law and the grace show us that we cannot earn our salvation in any form or fashion. We can't do it by keeping the law, and we can't do it by achieving more good than bad or some kind of math formula like that. Our only hope is grace, and grace is a reminder that we cannot earn our salvation. We need it as a gift of God through Jesus Christ. So the law shows us how desperate our plight is, how really far from God we are. Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the word sin is an archery term. So we have the target. I used to think of it in terms of we missed the bullseye. My brother and I used to, we still do on rare occasions, we'll sight in a new gun. He's a better shot, so I'm watching, through a scope, and like you're high to the left, and so we're trying to, we're off by a little bit. That's kind of the way I always understood, missed the mark. So we're at the second half of the verse, and we fall short of the glory of God. Here's the target, and my arrow made it here. Like it didn't even get to the target. That's how bad off we are. It isn't like we scored 1 instead of 10 for the bullseye. We got nothing. And I know some of you are like, well, yeah, but my arrow fell on the ground closer than yours. Well, good for you. I mean, we're in desperate, and the law points that out. The law shows us how sinful and how bad we are. Conversely, grace shows us the only way out of our sin, the only way out of our plight. So the law tells us we can't earn it. So where do we go? Well, now we go to grace. So think of it this way. The law pushes us to grace. The law drives us to grace. The law makes us aware of our desperate need for the grace of God. The law makes us appreciate the grace of God. When we see how far short we fall, and to know that God still loves us and sent His Son Jesus to die for us and to grant us everlasting life and to forgive us of all of our unrighteousness and to grant to us the righteousness of Jesus Christ on our account, that God would just give all of that to us by His amazing and astounding grace. The law makes grace viewable for us. It makes we realize the necessity of grace. So if we don't see the law, we don't see our need for grace. If we don't compare ourselves to the law, we don't recognize how desperately we need Jesus. And so one of the reasons why a lot of people reject Jesus is because they don't think they really need Him. They don't see how desperately they need Him. Well, I'm not that bad a person. And you're probably not that bad a person. If you were that bad a person, you'd be in prison. But the reality is, it's not how good or bad you are as a citizen or as a neighbor or as a family member or worker. It's everything about you, everything you've ever thought, every website you've ever gone to, everything you've ever said. I mean, it's not just some actions that you've done. It's not just, but all of it. And when you begin to compare all of that against the stringent law of God, you realize, man, I'm in trouble. I am in trouble. I'm in desperate trouble. Where do I go? Well, we go to Jesus. So here's the idea. The law can't save you, but it shows you your need to be saved. And that drives you to grace, and grace tells you how you can be saved. By the gift of God when we trust in Jesus Christ. Here's how the Bible says it in Ephesians. For by grace are you saved through faith. And that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Like it's all of grace. Even our faith is grace gift of God. Like it's all God's grace. But we don't throw ourselves on that grace. We don't see the need for that grace unless we've seen the law. Okay? Because the very next verse in Ephesians says, for we are His workmanship created in Christ Jesus, that we should go and do good works that He ordained beforehand. So what are the good works that we do? What the law tells us. So the law drives us to grace for salvation. And then salvation sends us back to the law for righteous living. Not righteous living in order to be right with God, but the righteous living because we are right with God through grace. So John's not telling us get rid of the law because we have grace. John is telling us the law could only bring us so far. It could only bring us to the need for salvation. Grace through Jesus Christ is the way we get salvation. So they work in tandem with one another. Grace is meaningless without the law, because without the law, we don't see our sin. We don't really need grace. But grace needs the law because the law shows us that we need grace. But the law needs grace because the law can't get us right with God. Only grace can do that. So they both work together. So what John is saying is that the law was given through Moses. We know we're sinners because of that. But grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Here's the way we're forgiven for having broken the law. So don't see these two as opposed to one another. See them working together with one another. The law shows us our sin and drives us to grace. Grace brings us salvation and then sends us to the law on how we are to live as people who have been forgiven, how God expects us to live. No, we're still not going to keep the law fully, but we don't feel compelled to keep the law fully because we've been forgiven, because we experienced grace. But because we experienced grace, we want to live the law. We want to live pleasing to God the best that we can. And so they work in tandem like that, and that's what helps us to grow and develop as Christians. And people that get too one-sided to the law become very legalistic and self-righteous. People that lean too much onto grace become what's called antinomian. They pretty much anything goes. Nothing is wrong. Everything's okay because grace allows us pretty much to do whatever we want to. And the Bible doesn't teach that either. The two work together. And so when we keep those two in balance, then that's when we really grow and bloom and blossom in our Christian walk. So I hope that helps you a little bit with law and grace that we find in the Bible and how they are not enemies, but they are complementary companions, and we need both of them. So this week, if you're a believer, I pray that God will empower you to live out the law in your life. If you're not a believer, I hope you realize when you read the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, God's law, how far you've fallen short, how desperately you need God's grace, and that you turn to Jesus Christ. So don't get locked in the law. You'll become self-righteous or totally depressed. But don't get so locked into grace that there's no righteous living. There's no expectation. You think, I can just do whatever I want to. It's not like that. We need both of them to help us move forward correctly in the Christian life. So God bless you. Have a great day.